Hi, everyone. Leo Tonkin here for the Salt Therapy Association, and it's STAcon 2020. We're getting ready for the Salt Therapy Conference, and we're going to be speaking with, in a moment, the author of Breath, The New Science of a Lost Art by James Nestor. I've been reading this book. I'm right in the middle of it. It is a fascinating book. Anybody in the salt therapy business should be reading this book. It's all about how we have evolved as a species, how our breathing impacts everything about us, how we've moved from nose breathers to mouth breathers, and how that has caused such conditions with sleep apnea and respiratory conditions and so much more. So we're going to be talking with James to give a little preview of what's coming up at the conference for his keynote speech. So please make sure you check out the book. You'll be able to find out more about this coming up here shortly. Hi, everyone. Leo Tonkin here with James Nestor, the best-selling author of Breath, The New Science of a Lost Art. It came out in May, and I thought it was interesting. Here you are having a book about respiratory and the evolution in our conditions and anything. I know it wasn't necessarily timing, but how does this, and I know there's so much more about this book that we'll be going into at the conference in your presentation, but is there any connection between how this is coming out and people responding to what's happening with COVID?
Well, yeah, it was a complete coincidence. You know, some people had said, oh, very convenient. You happen to release your book during a pandemic. And this book was in catalogs in September. So it takes books about 6 months to come out. So it's been completely surreal because so many of the experts that I've talked to have been talking about this stuff for decades, literally decades, accumulating science, looking at the data, formulating different exercises to improve breathing. And they have been, I won't say largely ignored, but many of them have been ignored. And so now they're not so ignored anymore about the importance of breathing. We know that respiratory health is a huge and significant marker on whether or not you're going to be suffering from the worst symptoms of COVID. So just another reason to pay attention to your breathing.
Yeah. Well, I like the, I'm fascinated because I'm learning so much about it. I've been in the salt therapy business now for 9 years or so. And I know we just briefly talked about it not that long ago, and you're finding out more about it. Obviously, being on the ocean, being an avid surfer and other things that you've done, know a lot about the qualities and the benefits of salt. But it's also interesting for our industry that there's been a shift in a focus on respiratory wellness, respiratory hygiene, and what people can be doing. Salt therapy is one of those modalities, but a lot about what your book talks about is sort of our evolution and the cause of why we have these respiratory conditions and what people can do to actually fix them. So what are some of the key things that you'll be talking about at the conference coming up?
Well, so few of us breathe well, and a lot of people don't believe that. But then you start looking at the stats. You look at the amount of people who have asthma or sleep apnea or COPD or emphysema, on and on. You say, wow, that's the majority of the population. And that's exactly what's happened. So some of this is due to environmental problems. We know that. But a lot of it is due to anatomical problems, things that happened in our evolution over just the past few hundred years. When I learned this, it absolutely blew my mind. I had no idea about this, but I spent years with the experts in the field. They showed me the skulls of our ancestors who had these perfectly straight teeth, these big forward growing faces, larger airways because of that. Then you look at almost any modern skull, it's the opposite type of growth. Our faces are growing flatter, teeth are crooked, smaller airways. So to think that this is something that has just happened so recently in our evolution was shocking to me. And once you acknowledge that problem, then you can look at ways of fixing it and remedying so many of these chronic respiratory issues.
It's interesting to me too, in a lot about what you write about, there are people that actually, and a lot of people in the salt therapy industry do practice breath work, and some of them are doing breath work inside of salt rooms or salt booths and guided meditation and focused and alternate breathing and some of the things that are becoming more popular. But I know your previous book was about deep divers and holding their breath. And as I shared with you, I had cancer a couple of years ago, had a tracheotomy in me, and I still have my kind of sleep apnea and things that I have to work on. But the things that you talked about here, it's like there's so much available that people don't know that they don't know about how simple breathing techniques can actually make a difference in your health.
Yeah, it's such a simple thing. You know, for most of our life, we don't have to think about breathing. We only think about it when we lose the ability to breathe. But I think that that has really not served us too well, because when you take conscious control of your breathing, you're able to influence so many other functions in your body, your immune system, your nervous system, your mental state, your circulation, heart rate. Like, breathing is the anchor to all these things. And we've seen there's a very firm foundation of science showing that conscious breathing activities are so effective for so many of these chronic problems.
Yeah. Well, I know earlier you mentioned about the environmental conditions. Obviously, you've got the evolution, as you talk about in the book a lot, about how we evolved and the way our noses and different part of our physiological makeup has made an impact in the environment that has shifted. But I also wonder, you know, when COVID comes out and they talk about people that are more of the elderly, they've been breathing in toxic air maybe for longer, and you know what has happened with our age. How do you balance what you're learning about the breath work and evolution with what you mentioned earlier about the climate?
Well, as our bodies age, we lose respiratory health. Our lungs get smaller. So all of this musculature around here starts shrinking in a bit because we're losing bone mass and we lose flexibility. So between the ages of 30 and 50, I think we lose 15% of our lung capacity, and then way more after that. So as we age, to me, one of the most important things is to take care of your respiratory health. We've seen in studies, in the Framingham study from the 80s, they took 30 years of data of 5,000 people and found that the number one marker that was the most accurate marker of longevity was how healthy these people's lungs were, how big they were. So luckily with breathing, it's something that we can actively change. It's harder to gain bone mass later in life, but we can change our breathing because we can influence our lung capacity. And so I really think that this is a missing pillar of health. A lot of people are looking at how much they exercise, counting their 10,000 steps. They're looking at what they're eating, every single calorie, but they're not looking at their breathing. And without having breathing, you will never be healthy, no matter what you do, if you're not breathing properly.
Well, it's still going to ring true for so many people that are going to be seeing this, which is what, you know, salt therapy is all about: respiratory hygiene, respiratory wellness. And it seems fairly simple. You know, we do have some people that are medical professionals that are now starting to really get into salt therapy. We have a pulmonologist on the board. We have respiratory therapists that are on board with their own salt rooms and facilities, and others. Why is this not something that is more knowledgeable and out there? I mean, we have the same struggle with educating people about, you know, salt therapy.
It takes time. You know, it takes a long time for science to catch up and for the public to catch up. If you look at nutrition, so we've known for a long time that processed foods were bad news. High carb, high sugar stuff was bad news. How long did it take between those studies being conducted and for us to actually change our habits? Only recently has it become well known that that food is bad and whole foods are better. And I'd be hard pressed to find someone who would be arguing for mushy canned foods nowadays. It just doesn't happen. So these things come in cycles. There's this book I read by Thomas Kuhn called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. So what he was saying is it really has nothing to do with data. You can accumulate all of this data, but it will just sit there until the moment comes where people will recognize this data as being valid. Then things change. We've seen that with food. I really think we're going to start to see that with breathing very soon.
Yeah, well, it reminds me of, you know, paradigm shifting, you know, a bit, and that mindset. You know, I know that you're going to be speaking at the Global Wellness Summit, and you're seeing the pendulum swing, I think, to more self-care, and you're seeing more people taking more self-responsibility about their well-being. So we're seeing that in the spa industry a lot, in the hospitality industry, where you're seeing this kind of shift to what do we need to do to really bring more wellness to people. And I think it's interesting that, you know, here we are at the growth of the salt therapy industry that really is, less than a decade old. We've got about 2,000 members worldwide in 25 countries. This has been a popular modality over in Europe for quite some time. So we know that here in North America, they're slow adopters, to your point, education and awareness. The one thing I was trying to find out a little bit more about that I may not have gotten to it all because I got all my flaps and dog ears in the book right now of everything to talk about. But what was the inspiration for the book? I know that you did, research about the deep diving and how people can hold their breath for 8 minutes and, whatever, that is a whole phenomenon. But what prompted this to come to fruition from that?
That was really the jumping off point, to see these free divers who were doing things that were considered scientifically impossible. These were tall people, short people, large people. I mean, you name it, people from 30 different countries who had, through just willpower, managed to train themselves, train their lungs to hold their breath for 7, 8, 9 minutes at a time, to dive down to depths of 300 feet with no fins or anything, just swimming down there. And so you see that, and then you see what science had thought was possible with the human body, and you say, if we've forgotten an ability like this, and freediving has been around, there's archaeological evidence stating that people were diving down to at least 100 feet 10,000 years ago. So if we've lost that ability, if breathing can take us there, where else can it bring us? And that was a question that I kept asking myself while I was writing the book Deep. And I was collecting stories, crazy stories along the way. I was talking to experts, talking to academics, talking to clinicians, and this whole other story sort of came out around that. And I learned a lot of things. Is the most important thing is that science is not a closed book. You can't think just because it's in a textbook, anything outside of that textbook doesn't exist. Science is constantly moving and revising itself, which is a beautiful thing. That's exactly what it should be doing. So 30 years ago, we were thought that the autonomic nervous system was called autonomic because it was supposed to be automatic, beyond our control. Wrong. We can control it. Guess how? With breathing. We can also add bone density to our faces by chewing. So all of these things that we had assumed were impossible, medically impossible, are starting to be overturned now. And it's a very exciting time to be exploring that research.
No, well, I think it's really great. I mean, the same thing with salt therapy. There's been a lot of studies, some that need to really be more developed, and additional studies that need to be done, a lot of anecdotal and testimonial type stuff that you talk about in the book. But I know your time, I appreciate you taking a breath break, so to speak. And I think it's great. I just know that you've been being interviewed a lot, and there's just so much information coming out now, all about respiratory and with COVID and everything. And I just really appreciate you taking the time out here with coming to the Salt Therapy Association less than 2 weeks away. And we're telling everybody all about this book and getting it out there. And I will have it read by the time you speak, so I'll be a little bit more prepared for that. And then we're going to have to get you not just on the salted beach in the salt life, but we got to get you into some of the salt rooms around you and listen and get your sense of your breath work and the people that what that's like inside of a salt room.
Yeah, I'm really curious to learn more about it. I'll be honest, I don't know much about it, but I'm curious to look at the science, look at the studies, look at the data, and have my own experience to test it out. So looking forward to that conversation.
Great. Thanks a lot, James.